Here's what the Constitution says that Congress may do. First, they have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, providing their uniform. Now, does that mean we can buy missiles, carriers, tankers, bombers, etc., and ignore the rest of the citizenry and their needs for housing, food, etc.? I don't believe so. The Constitution says we're to provide for the general welfare. Not only are we to provide for our own defense, but we are also charged with providing for the people that live here, for our citizenry. Now, the industrialists and the rulers would like us to ignore that part of it. They have taken over and they want the government for their purposes only and to serve them only. They could give a shit less about whether the peasantry has food or clothing, health care, or a place to live even. It doesn't matter to them. What matters is making money. Now, they can make money. They always have. And they've been levied taxes. And the taxes have been for the benefit of all. So we can't levy a tax on the people to buy an aircraft carrier or to invade a country. It's up to Congress to do that. Next, Congress can borrow money to the credit of the United States. That doesn't mean that they have to have reserves. That doesn't mean that they can't print this, that, or the other. It doesn't say anything about a gold standard. What it says is on the faith and credit of the United States government, through its Congress, can borrow money. Now, if you borrow, you got to pay it back. That's from the definition of borrowing. But we can figure out what the wealth of the country is and borrow against it, if Congress so chooses. The next thing they can do is regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. Now, this is curious, the last part of it, within Indian tribes. So, we have a situation in North Dakota. And this is a land that belonged initially to the Indians. It's part of the Indian tribes, the Sioux Nation, in fact. And there's a debate whether or not a pipeline should go through there. And the pipeline could contaminate water conceivably. The state of North Dakota has sent troopers there to thwart and frustrate the American Indians. But according to the Constitution, that's a job for Congress. Also, it said that we regulate commerce between the various nations. That's the job of our government, not the job of our industrialists or our great businessmen, our financiers. No, it's the job of the people, of the government. And they can do it for the best interest of the government, and not for the best interest of General Motors. The next thing that they can do is to establish uniform rule of naturalization and laws on the subject of bankruptcies throughout the United States. That means that we can't have all these different states making all these different rules, passing all these different laws on who can be citizens and not. That's up to the Congress. Next, to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and a foreign coin, and fix the standards of weights and measures. So, fixing standards is a function of the government. You look back in the old days in England, and they used to have the scales that merchants used, and they'd put their thumbs on the scale, or they would have different types of weight that would favor the merchant. And it got to be quite scandalous. So they established Pipedra courts in the United Kingdom, and that was where the first inklings of standardization occurred. So we don't want the Colorado ounce, the Iowa ounce, the Georgia ounce. We want an ounce. We want a gallon. We want a pint. And it should be standard throughout the country. That is the job of Congress, to make sure that happens. Also, to coin money. We can't have each state making money and choking commerce between the states, choking movement between the states, etc. So again, Congress has that power. Next, it says to provide for the punishment of counterfeiting the securities and current coin of the United States. So if somebody counterfeits our securities or any of our coins, they want Congress to do something about it. Congress is the only one that can do something about it. The next thing is to establish post offices and post roads. And this is really curious because since the 1980s, there's been a big push to provide privatized industry in the area of post offices and post roads. It's always been deemed advantageous for a country, for its citizenry, to maintain communications, and that's what this provision is about. There's nothing in there that says anybody should be entitled to make money from this communication. So in the colonial days, they built toll roads, and when the roads were paid for, they would go back to the government, to the state. That's probably the way it should be. Sorry about that, just thinking about what I was going to say next. I know that UPS and Federal Express and some of those don't like what I say, but it's a constitutional mandate. And by splitting up the post office, by deregulating, by making other people compete with it, it destroys the communication system within the country, and it is contrary to what the Constitution provides. It specifically says this is a job for Congress. Next, it says Congress shall promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and investors the exclusive right to respect their writings and discoveries. That sets up the patent office and intellectual property. The next is to constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. That seems clear enough. The next one, number 10, is to define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas, and offenses against the laws of nations, the law of nations. Now that is really kind of important too, because we have treaties. There is an established law of nations, and it's based on power. And our government in the last 4 or 5 decades have chosen pretty much to ignore the laws of the nations and become more or less dictatorial in their application. So, not only that, through confiscation laws, they have taken the idea of piracy one step further and given that power of piracy to the various governments within the United States. The next one is to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, make rules concerning capture on land and water. Again, is up to Congress, not the various states. To raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be longer than the term of 2 weeks. Well, that's probably been amended. To provide and maintain a navy. We still do that. To make rules for government and regulation of the land and naval forces. That's the Uniform Code of Military Justice and other things. And to provide for the calling forth of the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrection, and repel invasions. So, if we make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces, that puts them under Congress, not the other way around. You have presidents running saying they're commander-in-chief. They might be commander-in-chief, but they're still subject to the will and oversight of the Congress. The next provision is to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. Now, this gets interpreted in many ways and misinterpreted in many ways. First off, let's determine what a militia is. Well, the Constitution of Colorado says that a militia is all male citizens above the age of 18. It's not a National Guard or anything like that. Certain advocates want us to believe that a militia is a federally or state sponsored and governed military, and it's something unusual. It's not unusual. In England, they used to raise the hue and cry of militia all the time, and all of the citizenry would grab their weapons, their hoes, etc., and answer that hue and cry. When the United States was formed, they said we wouldn't have a standing army, and everybody essentially was a militia person. And militia had certain duties. Militia were consisting of free men. So when one of my ancestors got to be a free man in Massachusetts, he had to have a rifle, he had to go hunt, he had to provide for the common good of the community in Plymouth Colony and help supply them with food, and also to help fend off attacks from various neighbors. This was his duty. This was what he was charged with. This is what he couldn't derelict. And it's also something he couldn't delegate to someone else. So the Constitution says that it's to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia and governing such part of them as may be employed. Well, that's later turned into the reserves and National Guard, but the Constitution envisions something a lot more comprehensive than that. And it says that it shall provide for the appointment of officers and the authority of training according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. Now, one aspect of militia is that of police. So Congress shall be in charge of training them, and training them in such a manner as to conform to the Constitution. This is overlooked by a lot of people. The next provision is to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district as may, by secession of particular states and the acceptance of Congress, become the seat of the government, and to exercise authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislatures of the state in which the same shall be for the enactment of forts, magazines, arsenal, dockyards, and other meaningful buildings. That sets up the area of Washington, D.C. And lastly, to make the laws which shall be necessary and proper to carry out the execution of the foregoing powers and all the powers vested by the Constitution of the government of the United States, the department or officer thereof. So that's the general background on what the Constitution provides for in the beginning.